Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on identifying causal factors in safety event investigations. I'm Stuart Mader, and I lead the Public Transportation Agency Safety Plans, or PTASP, Technical Assistance Center within FTA's Office of Transit Safety and Oversight. We're also joined today by Andrew Lofton, a contractor supporting FTA's PTASP Technical Assistance Center, as well as some industry speakers, which we'll introduce momentarily. Throughout the webinar, we invite you to type your questions into the Q&A box here on the webinar, and FTA staff will review these questions and will provide answers at the end of the presentation. And we'll also look to bring your questions to our industry speakers as well during the discussion. These slides and a recording of this webinar will be available on the PTASP Technical Assistance Center's resource library within a couple of days after today's webinar. Our goal for today's webinar is to review PTASP requirements for investigations, define causal factors, and discuss the purpose of assigning causal factors during safety event investigation. We hope you'll take the opportunity to add your voice to the discussion by participating in polls and, again, sharing your questions for our panelists. And I'll now turn it over to Andy to go over today's agenda.
Thanks so much, Stuart, and welcome, everyone. During today's webinar, we're going to start off by providing an introduction to causal factor identification and assignment. And then for the most exciting part of today's session, we're going to hear from industry speakers. They're going to share their experience dealing with causal factor identification and assignment. And then, as we always do with our PTASP TAC webinars, we're going to close out the session with a Q&A session. So throughout the webinar, as we're proceeding, going through content, please, we encourage you to use the Q&A pod to submit your questions so that we can queue them up for the question and answer session at the end. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to get the opportunity today to speak with two public transit industry representatives. The first is Rebecca Frankhauser, who is the Chief Safety Officer and the Director of Safety, Security, and Quality Assurance at King County Metro, and also Raymond Blethen, the Northeast Director of Operations for First Transit. We're very excited to have both Rebecca and Raymond with us today. But before we get into our content, we did want to remind everyone about the resources that FTA makes available on this topic and other topics related to safety management systems. There's an entire resource library related to the PTASP regulation, and that's going to include resources that are related to SRM, safety risk management, and safety assurance, two topics that we'll touch on a little today, as well as safety event investigation. So we encourage everybody to visit the PTASP TAC resource library at www.transit.dot.gov/PTASP-TAC. We also understand that some of you may have questions about the bipartisan infrastructure law. We encourage you to please visit FTA's bipartisan infrastructure law website for questions and answers about that. And that is located at www.transit.dot.gov/BIL. And with that, I'm going to hand the microphone back over to Stuart to talk about our feedback process. Stuart?
Thanks, Andy. And we want to just take a moment to thank everybody who has completed surveys for our previous webinars. That feedback continues to help us develop and deliver these webinars and to deliver resources and tools through the resource library that are most relevant to your needs. And based on your feedback, we're continuing to evolve the webinar format so that you'll hear from more voices. You'll see industry speakers today offering their insight and perspectives. Your audience polls coming up just in a moment, and then we'll have opportunities during the Q&A as well for you to ask your questions and get technical assistance and feedback and insight from all of us here on the webinar today. And with that, it's time to bring up our first poll. Andy?
Thanks, Stuart. And we're going to bring up, you should see it on your Zoom screen momentarily, an audience poll. And we're interested in hearing from you before we get started about your level of experience conducting any of the following activities. One, if you have experience conducting on-site safety event investigations. And you can check as many as that apply to you. If you have experience conducting safety event investigation interviews, testing materials or reviewing data or video recording related to safety event investigations, determining causal factors, perhaps writing safety event investigation reports, or perhaps you have no experience with any of those activities. So we'll let everybody check the boxes that apply. We'll give everyone a moment before we close our poll. All right. Wow, we have very consistent responses from everybody. About 2/3 of our group have experience with all of those topics that we talked about. And that's great. I think that speaks well for the topic that we're going to cover today. And it means that we're all going to be speaking the same language, especially when we get to hear from our industry experts that are helping us today. And with that, I'll pass it back to Stuart. Stuart, it's all yours.
Thanks, Andy. And for those of you who responded in the poll that this is new to you, we're glad you're here as well. And we're going to spend just a moment talking about the requirements in the PTASP regulation, as well as a little bit of coverage on causal factors. We hope that helps you, gives you some grounding in the material. So to set the stage for today's discussion, let's briefly review the federal requirement for causal factor identification. The PTASP regulation requires transit agencies as part of their SMS activities to develop and implement safety performance monitoring and measurement activities as part of the safety assurance process. This includes the requirement to conduct investigations of safety events to identify causal factors. Since we're focusing on causal factors today, we won't go into a lot of detail about safety events during this webinar. There are, in the PTASP resource library, we have some additional information about safety events, including definitions and more resources on investigations. In particular, we recommend checking out our 2022 webinar on safety event investigation in an SMS. That's a good companion to the content we'll talk about today. And now let's go back to Andy and we'll hear a little bit more about causal factors. Andy?
Thanks so much, Stuart. So first off, we should cover what is a causal factor. We always start with definitions and requirements in our PTASP TAC webinars as they're defined in the PTASP regulation. However, for this one, the PTASP regulation does not give us a specific definition. So transit agencies could define causal factors as those key actions, situations, or conditions that directly lead to a safety event. And when we talk about causal factors, we often talk about contributing factors. Contributing factors could be defined as those actions, situations, or conditions that made the event more likely to occur, or that perhaps made that outcome more severe. But in general, without the causal factor, the event wouldn't have happened. And without the contributing factor, the event may have been more or less likely to occur, or its outcome would have been less severe. So let's take a look at a very simple example to illustrate the two concepts of causal factors and contributing factors. Let's say that we have a worker carrying a large box, walking across the shop floor, trips and falls over a tool that was left on the floor. So our two factors in this example are the tool that was left on the shop floor and a large box that the individual was carrying. Now, how do we know which one of those two would be our causal factor? Well, as we just discussed, the causal factor is going to be the one that directly resulted in the trip and fall. We also should mention that in real life, we're not just talking about these simple examples, there often could be more than one causal factor, but for today's example and for simplicity, we're just going to focus on one causal factor. Now, the way to identify a causal factor, a very helpful way, would be to consider the event without one or the other factor. So let's start with the large box. So without the large box, the worker may still have tripped over the tool left on the shop floor. The large box that they were carrying likely obscured their vision. Would it make the worker more likely to trip over the tool left on the floor, but is not a direct lead to that trip. Now, in our example, if we were to remove the tool from the equation and the worker's just carrying the large box, there's no tool on the floor, the worker's not going to trip over the tool. So the causal factor in our very simple example is related to the tool that was left out on the floor. Now, while the trip and fall may still have happened if the worker wasn't carrying the box, the trip and fall would not have happened if the tool was not left on the shop floor. So the causal factor is related to the tool left on the shop floor, and the contributing factor is related to the large box being carried by the individual. And with that, I'm going to turn the microphone back over to Stuart for a brief discussion about assigning causal factors. Stuart?
Thanks, Andy. So an important reason to identify causal factors in safety event investigations is to prevent the same event from happening again, from reoccurring. Beyond providing safety risk management information to help agencies prevent the same event from occurring, causal factors are also useful in the safety risk management or SRM process as information for hazards, as well as mitigations, and also during safety risk assessment, understanding likelihood and severity as you assess risk. So how can we think about assigning causal factors that veers us away from preventability and toward causal factors? Some agencies may find it helpful to group their causal factors by broad categories. For example, thinking about human factors, errors that an individual made, intentional violations of procedures, failure of communication, or an individual's physical or mental preparedness to perform the task at hand. For example, could fatigue have been a factor? Another category to look at is in equipment and infrastructure factors. These could include equipment failing to function as intended, structural components of the transit system failing, components being missing, and so forth. Other categories, environmental factors. This includes lighting conditions, weather, surface conditions, obstructions in the operating environment. These could all be causal factors for a safety event. If you have, for instance, a dimly lit area, and you may have, for instance, a fire hydrant or a sign or a pole, and the visibility is poor, that could present a tripping hazard. Next category is organizational factors, and this includes things like supervisory decisions, resource management, the agency's culture or processes. These could all be causal factors for a safety event. And then another one is external factors. So these are factors that are outside of a transit agency's direct scope of control, and they could include oversight requirements, the broader political, social, societal environment surrounding the agency's work. Again, these are the factors that are outside of a transit agency's scope of control, but may contribute, may be causal factors. And with that, it's time for our next poll. Andy, over to you.
Thanks, Stuart. And before we get to our industry speakers, we want to hear from you guys one more time. I'm going to flash our poll up on the screen for you. And what we're capturing here is an idea of training that you may have received on identifying causal factors, if you have received any training on causal factor identification. And if you could select as many of the boxes that apply to you, we'd appreciate it. We'll give everyone a little time to answer, and then we'll display the results. All right, great. So it looks like most of our participants have received some form of training on causal factor identification. Either it was part of the investigation training that you had, so even about almost 2/3 as part of their SMS related training. That's excellent. And then we do have some folks with some specific causal factor identification training, so probably going to be our experts on today's participant list. And then also we have about 40% saying as part of their data collection and analysis training. very important aspect of this entire discussion is how do we use this information to inform decision making. So it's really good to see. And thank you guys again for your engagement, participation in our polls. It really helps add a richness to our webinars. We appreciate that. And with that, I'm going to hand the microphone back over to myself. I'm not handing it to anybody. And I'm actually going to take a second to introduce our industry speakers. As I mentioned before, our first is going to be Rebecca Frankhauser. She is the Chief Safety Officer and Director of Safety, Security, and Quality Assurance for King County Department of Metro Transit in Seattle, Washington. Rebecca leads a team charged with all aspects of industrial and operations safety, security, emergency management, hazard management, auditing, data acquisition and analysis, SMS implementation, and training. Rebecca is heavily involved in the industry as a TSI Senior Associate staff member, teaching the principles of safety management systems and transit safety and security audit courses, is an appointed member of the FTA's Transit Advisory Committee for Safety, TRACS, serves on peer review panels, participates on TCRP panels, and is the vice chair of APTA's Safety Coordinating Council. So welcome, Rebecca. Thank you for joining us. And our second participant from our industry group today is Raymond Blevin. Raymond has been in the transit industry for 26 years. He started his career as a driver, which has given him the ability to understand that the challenges that drivers, supervisors, and managers encounter, and helps him work with those individuals to find the best solutions. Raymond joined First Transit 22 years ago and has continued to hold progressively more important roles at various locations throughout the Northeast, including Merrimack Valley Regional Transit Authority, Lowell Regional Transit Authority, and the Nashua Transit System. In May of 2016, he became an area GM, and then in November of 2018, he became the Northeast Director of Operations, where he began overseeing the GHTD location. In this role, he's been responsible for providing local support in all areas of the operation, including finance, safety, customer service, and on-time performance. He served on First Transit's corporate safety advisory team and successfully implemented major service changes, expansions, and transitions in operation throughout the region, always focusing on safety. Raymond is a hands-on manager that uses his many years of experience to bring leadership and expertise to the locations he oversees and helps improve safety, increase productivity and customer service while focusing on the needs of contracting customers and riders. We are very happy to have both Rebecca and Raymond with us today. And with that, before we get to those great participants, I do want to put one final plug in for technical assistance. Reminding everybody, any questions you have after today's session, you can reach out to the PTAS Technical Assistance Center. We continue to operate our help desk to assist the transit industry with any PTAS-related questions, including questions about ASP development, implementation, evaluation, audit, and oversight. And as always, that help desk is available with a phone number at 877-827-7243 from 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. Monday through Friday, and via email at the email that's provided on your screen. And with that, Stuart, I'm going to hand the microphone back over to you.
Thanks, Andy, and welcome to both Rebecca and Raymond. We're really, really pleased to have you here and to get into our discussion. One of the things for the benefit of our broader webinar audience, I just want to mention is in preparing for these webinars, we have a conversation with our panelists ahead of the webinar itself to talk about the topics and issues we're going to bring up on the webinar. And I want to start off by bringing in something that Rebecca brought up in our pre-conversation for this webinar that I think is a really helpful jumping off point. Rebecca, you talked a bit about thinking about some inputs for safety event investigation and for the risk-based approach to thinking about causal factors that I thought was really helpful. And then you also brought up a point about where sometimes you have, and I think a lot of agencies face this, constraints in terms of the throughput of the safety team. And so I'd love to kick off by having you bring those up and bring that into the discussion.
Oh, sure. Yeah, as we as an industry are moving from lagging indicators to leading indicators, I think we all struggle with resource constraints, both, not having enough safety people in the industry, right, to bring in, right, we're all competing for the same resources, but also just figuring out what the right balance is, because I know at my agency, we've got about 3,500 collisions a year, and I've got 5 people that judge those collisions. So, that tells you how deep our investigations have been able to go historically. So, we have a lot of challenges as far as like which investigations do we really dive into versus which do we just simply look at preventability of. And so that's the culture change that we're having to shift into. So that's a real struggle for us.
That's an excellent point. I think it brings a dose of reality into the discussion, because we talk about the definition of causal factors, contributing factors, assigning them, and we're talking very much in the depth of an individual investigation. But the reality is, to your point, the throughput of your team, of an agency's team, and their ability to handle the incoming amount of events that need to be investigated is a significant factor. And I think to your point about looking at moving from lagging to leading indicators, it places, I think, a greater importance on looking at leading indicators and really looking at how can we get ahead of these events before they happen, and look at different inputs for hazard identification that push this back, so that we're preventing as many events as we can, and that way the events that we are investigating are and also the events that we're selecting to investigate are the ones that are likely to give us the most information that we can use to, in sort of a scaled up way, prevent a larger proportion of future safety events. And that's where I think the point you brought up too on a pre-call about connectivity across the organization and looking at inputs that you might not think of as sort of the usual suspects in terms of inputs. Can you talk a little about that too?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, once we have a safety database, we've got all this wonderful data, but as we're investigating incidents, I can think of one great example. At my own agency, we had an incident where a coach ran through a red light and got into a collision. And upon investigation, we discovered that there had been quite a few customer complaints that this particular operator had a history of running red lights. And we realized that our customer database wasn't connecting with our safety database. So we were missing a whole slew of indicators. And so had we known about that, we could have potentially corrected behaviors, right? And not in a punitive manner, but with retraining or some other mechanism to identify those behaviors in advance, so that we never would have even had that collision. So we have to look at how our data is talking. We had a pretty famous incident on the light rail system, as an example, where there was some damage done to the undercarriage of the trains, and we didn't flag that in the safety system, and noticed that there was a bolt that was hitting the undercarriage of the trains, right? And so had we realized that was happening, and identified that as a hazard, it could have prevented some additional damage down the road. So there's now a challenge of making sure that your data systems are communicating, not just leaning on your safety data, right?
It's a great example, and I think it shows how thinking about an investigation and understanding what the causal factor was, it can prompt thinking about how can we extend that knowledge and that understanding of where a causal factor came up to looking sort of out at where other events could happen and identifying potential hazards before they become a causal factor in a future investigation. And there's obviously challenges in doing that, but that mindset and that approach to thinking is really valuable. Thanks, Rebecca. Raymond, I want to turn to you for a minute and bring up something that you brought up in our pre-discussion that I thought was another really important area to talk about, and that's technology. You brought up some examples of technology and how that has played a role in your safety event investigations and in some of your mitigations. And I'd love to have you expand on that for the group here as well.
Yeah, sure. I think, when we had started talking casually, we had talked about, I've seen, I always used to refer to buses as old 1973 Volvos, big square things going down the road that our drivers have to control. But we've all talked a lot about autonomous vehicles and things like that. But one of the things that I really like about the autonomous vehicles is not, there's many things, but on the safety side, it's brought new technology that's being used for AI and all sorts of other factors. You have drive cam or smart drive or all these other products out there that are now identifying risks, whether you're rolling through stop signs or you're speeding. Our phones and Google, they know what speed limits are. There's tons of apps out there and tons of different programs, but all of this technology is advancing very quickly, and it's creating a whole nother layer of data that we need to try to understand. And it's identifying risks long before we have the collision, where we then investigate why did this happen and try to respond and prevent it from happening again. We now can start to see things that are happening in advance. And so I think that technology is going to continue to grow very quickly. And I think, one of the Q&A questions that already popped up was, how are you managing all that stuff? And I think that that's going to be a challenge as we move forward, because all these different technologies are popping up. They're providing us with a whole slew of new data and resources, and trying to combine that with the driver just doing reports and saying, hey, here's a safety risk, here's a hot spot, and turning that in on a piece of paper to the dispatcher at the end of the day, trying to loop that in and tie that in with a report that's coming from some sort of technology or GPS device that's on your vehicle that's identifying every time the driver hits the brakes hard. And trying to combine those two things is, I think, going to be a challenge. And it depends on the size of the transit agency, right? If a smaller agency that might only have 10 or 15 buses is going to have a lot less data coming in than a huge location like Rebecca's managing that has data from all different modes of transportation and identifying risks. And so that's going to pose a much larger challenge.
That's a great point. And that example you just shared, the idea of being able to look at data on braking and see that there's, if a driver is braking hard in an area, it allows you to think about, when we go back to thinking about those categories of factors. Certainly a human factor could be there, but it's also entirely likely and quite probable that other factors could be at play, including, environmental factors, could have changes in, we think about recent years, changes in commuting patterns, changes in work habits, related to the impact of COVID. You could have changing travel patterns on a road that mean that there's more congestion at different times of day. There could be changes in construction activity on a road, and those things could be putting an operator in a position where sudden braking, harder braking is happening, and that's an opportunity to identify that through the data, and then look at mitigations for it. One of the other things that we talked about earlier that I think is another important area to talk about as we think about this, looking at data, is how we work with how agency management in particular, from the safety department on through, works with and in coordination with labor on these things. I think that's a really important one, because what we're talking about here is a mindset shift in how we look at data. And that means both some risks and some opportunities in terms of how that is perceived and received, and some opportunities for conversations around that. Rebecca, you brought up a couple of really good points about that, particularly around the notion of looking at data like this, not because you want to be punitive, but because you want to not have to reach the point where an incident happens that where there has to be disciplinary action that could mean somebody, having a sanction on their job or a suspension or even losing their job. Wondering if you, it looks like you might still be on mute. I was wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit more about that and your perspective on it.
Yeah, I was wondering if there was a question in there. Yeah, we don't want to throw people away, right? Like, we want to save jobs. These are valuable, highly skilled operators, and so if we can provide them with the resources or the tools to compensate for some sort of skill deficiency, then we want to do that, absolutely. So the challenge that we have as safety professionals or, transit leaders is how do we identify those deficiencies and how do we partner with labor to ensure they understand that when we're identifying deficiencies, it's not because we want to be punitive, it's because we want to save jobs, we want to have a safe operation, we want to ensure that people, keep their paychecks. And so the challenge that's before us is when we create this non-punitive employee reporting, right? A way to have employees report on themselves, a way to identify trends, a way to mitigate behaviors, right? Like, how are we identifying those things? Because previously it was all after the fact, that we're punishing people, and we need to get to a place where we're identifying safety events and it's okay, and we're going to correct behaviors, right? So that's something that each agency has to identify for themselves, but we have to do it in partnership with labor because we're only going to be able to do it together. It's not something that we as an agency can solve. It's not something that labor can solve by themselves.
It's a really good point. And Raymond, I want to bring you into the discussion as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's, like Rebecca says, it's a very tough balance. I mean, when you add in the technology side that we were just talking about, and it's reporting, hard braking, and maybe that's because you're following too close to the vehicle in front of you. When we're looking at CBAs and collective bargaining agreements and other employee handbooks that we might have, and with employees, it could be, back in the day, it was, you got a verbal warning, a written warning, a suspension, and a termination. But, I think anybody that's, there's 500 people on this call, and we probably all can think about the 5 times in the last year that we've rolled through a stop sign, or we've followed somebody too close and hit the brakes too hard. And so trying to create a policy or a program is really important, and building the relationship with your workforce to do that is critical. So that's created another set of challenges and boundaries that we all have to work with.
Very good point. And Raymond, something else you said in our conversation earlier, I thought was important as well. You said you hate the notion of at fault in our industry, and I think it plays into what you just said there. Can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, I think a lot of people, especially when we're talking to new supervisors or new folks that are in our safety department that we're growing through the field, people look at who's at fault. And, I've really tried to break that up into different categories. And, the police might look at who's at fault to issue a citation, or the insurance companies might look at who's at fault to decide who's paying for the damages. But on us, we really need to look at what's preventable, what's non-preventable, and we need to look at all the factors that are going into how could we have prevented this collision. And that goes far beyond, our drivers. And Rebecca has some great examples, and if you want, I can share an example of what we can do to prevent collisions. If you want me to go forward with that?
Sure, that'd be great.
In this picture behind me, this is our beautiful facility in East Hartford, Connecticut at GHTD. And the vehicles pull through this fuel bay, and the drivers pull through it every day, and they have to make a very hard turn when they leave that. And we found that drivers, these 2 cones, and I'm not good with my pointing on the camera, but the 2 yellow posts there would get tail swings. The drivers would clip the tail swing. There's 160 vehicles there, so we might not even know it, but I would walk up and I would see a new little black mark every week on that pole, and trying to figure out, all right, who did this? How do we have that? The first solution, which you can see in here, is adding cones. We measured the tail swing of the vehicles, and we knew that it was around 12 inches. I think these cone widths were around 13 inches at the base. So we said, all right, if the tail swing is 12 inches and we keep the vehicle at least 13 inches away from that pole, then the tail swing will never hit that pole. We can prevent it. So sure, it's our driver's action that's causing the collision, but we could prevent this by putting in some safety measures. Then we found, all right, well, those cones get knocked over, nobody replaces them and puts them back up. And so what else can we do? And we added those rubber parking stoppers that you see in parking lots. Sometimes there's concrete ones, sometimes they're rubber. We ordered some rubber ones from an online vendor that was very inexpensive. It was about $50. And we put 2 of those down, and it created that 13 inches, and it created a curb that's not going to blow out the tire if the driver curbs it. and also going to keep that vehicle more than the 13 inches away. So now we don't have blown tires, we don't have buses curbing or having tail swings hit those poles, and we've now done stuff to prevent that collision. And hopefully, as we go through, we're training the drivers on, it's not just something that's there, we're teaching the drivers during the new hire process and during safety pep rallies and safety meetings, why are those curbs there? Those curbs are there to prevent tail swings. And the real message to the drivers is, if we just stay 13 inches away from something, no matter where we are in our service area, then we're not going to hit anything with our tail swing. And so teaching people what that gap is was critical in not only preventing the collisions at the location, but also preventing those tail swing collisions throughout our entire service area by having folks understand what that distance is and learning their reference points from their vehicle.
I think that's an excellent example, and it shows how you can take a mitigation can be quick to implement and low cost. And the implication of hitting a rubber barrier or a cone, the cost of that compared to the cost of the vehicle or the fixed infrastructure is obviously much lower. And you've also it's an opportunity to empower your employees, because by educating them about why the barriers are there, the curbs are there, it's an opportunity to also say, are there other locations where this is a challenge where we should install these? It may not just be at this one garage or this one facility. And maybe also be an opportunity thinking about those external factors. If there are places out on the infrastructure you don't control, but the same issues there, you've got a mitigation that you can show community partners, and thinking of municipalities, DOTs, for example. So it's a mitigation that you've addressed one type of incident, you've addressed a contributing factor, and you've now create an opportunity to bring that mitigation to other places as well. And Rebecca, I know when we talked, you had a great example of one of the challenges with your electric buses and some infrastructure challenges, and how you work to the getting to the causal factor on that and the mitigations. Would you be able to talk about that one next?
Yeah, sure. And it's less about electric buses and more about involving the right people in decisions. So the example that Stuart's talking about is, we had a situation where a route that specific coaches with battery electric coaches were going down, especially during commuting hours, had to make a wide swing on a right turn. And as they did that, in order to make that right turn, the wide swing would force them to go out into traffic, right? And during peak commuting hours, that wasn't possible. So they were popping up on a curb. Well, there was an awning at that location. So we kept having buses striking that awning. Well, with certain battery electric buses, particularly older models, the battery pack sat close to the edge. And so that was striking the awning. Well, if that battery pack was impeded, it was causing fires, right? And so if you specified a certain type of coach, it actually, like, that fire could burn that coach down, and that damage was far greater on certain types of coaches than others, right? Which led to operators potentially losing their jobs because of the amount of damage. And so when you're talking about what coaches you're specifying on routes, like, we need to hold ourselves accountable, because that's an organizational accident issue. That's not so much an operator issue. Like, yes, there's training involved, and yes, they need to, be accountable for how they're operating. But also, if you're putting folks down routes where they cannot feasibly operate safely on a route, we need to look at the equipment that we're specifying, the type of route that they're going down, the schedule they're operating, and there's so many different factors that are involved that, like, it goes way beyond just operator behavior at that point.
I think that's another really good example, because it shows how, and it goes back to Raymond, what you said about the at fault as well. If we look at safety event investigation and we sort of stop at the at fault, there's a lot of instances where the end result of that is we stop short of really understanding the combination of factors that have led to an incident. And it's the combination of factors that allow us to fully understand the safety event, and also transfer to thinking about other types of safety events that could happen. If we're addressing human factors, well, hopefully that might stop the same event from happening again. At least the human factor causal factor, contributing factor, but we might miss the organizational factor or the environmental factor or the external factor. And addressing that may have the ability to mitigate a broader set of events than just the individual one that's at hand here. And Raymond, that's something else we talked about as well. You talked about the notion of sort of thinking about this in the old way versus the new way of thinking around kind of everything being around kind of damage and sort of controlling actions versus a new way where we're thinking about reconfiguring when we're addressing things with mitigations. We're sort of reconfiguring, and it could be physical reconfigurations to a route or turns or something, but also I think this larger idea of sort of reconfiguring the thinking and the approach around this. Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
I think you're in reference to like the planning and in the future, right? So
Yes.
one of the Q&As was actually like, is this used for, I was trying to figure out how to type and listen at the same time, and my mind was too busy. So hopefully this answers the Q&A question too. But I think it's critical that our transit agencies and that we're working with planning commissions in the local community, and as well as when we are doing those capital projects, we're looking at how do we mitigate these things? How do we design things so that we're not putting our drivers into those situations? Understanding clearances that are needed, understanding curb cuts that are needed, for example, but all of those things need to be done in the advance or in the planning stages. And when we look at capital projects and we look at reconfiguring things, for example, the example that I did use, we really need to look at how do we change the layout of the lot is, can we buy vehicles that fuel on the opposite side so that we can approach the fueling island differently? There's so many different parts to that. I don't know, does that answer kind of what you're saying? But
it does, yes. I think what it gets at is we're moving away from a very sort of narrow approach to thinking about individual events into the broader, to your point about looking at how an individual safety event is really a window into a broader set of factors. And some of those can be addressed by using that information well. We can incorporate those into changes we make that seem like they're unrelated to that safety event. So the example of your example of the design of a fueling pad and the clearances around that, mitigating events can happen at that level by using the information from an individual safety event and not just stopping at the, sort of preventing maybe stopping at the human factors around that event. In the past, we're looking much more deeply at how does the information we gain from that or glean from that influence how we think in a much broader way.
And I think we've been doing that for years as an industry. And you think about, we know drivers are gonna, they see a stale green, they're gonna accelerate and try to make it. And we want to try to eliminate as many risks as possible and make our routes as safe as possible. So I know lots of transit agencies, they try to avoid left turns at intersections when they're designing their routes as much as possible, so we're not turning in front of oncoming traffic. All of those different things. And Rebecca's example I love, because when we're looking at planning routes and what vehicles, what assets we're going to use on those, what are the barriers? Are there tree bushes that need to be cut back, or are there multiple lanes that we need to cross? So in the whole route design area as well is, whether it's in the yard or it's out on in the service area that we're providing service. So
very true. So as we start to get ready to transition over to Q&A in just a minute or so, I want to just wrap up with one last question for both of you. And that is there a particular technique or tool that you found especially useful in thinking about the work that you do on safety event investigations across your teams that you want to share with the audience here for this webinar? And I'll jump in and go first with an example, and that's something called a technique called the 5 whys. And the idea is that it's pretty much, as the name implies, it's asking the question why when you're conducting a safety event investigation and repeating it, not stopping at the first or even the second why, but pushing down deeper into asking why as you uncover one factor, asking why to make sure that you're hitting the point where you've gotten to really the last one, or at least you've gotten as far down as you can toward the causal factor that, as we said in the beginning of the webinar, that event that factor without which the event would have happened. So That's a tool I've found quite useful, and I'd love to hear from both of you. Any particular tools or techniques that you find very useful?
I could jump in. I don't know if it's a specific tool, but I will say there are many peers. I've gotten lots of text out of the 500 people. There's some people on here that I've had the pleasure of working with for many years, and many that I consider mentors and far better experts than myself that have taught me a lot. And there's one thing, actually somebody that's on here, they might text me later, but there's one thing that they had said to me a long time ago when I was the GM for a smaller location. We had lots of collisions occurring, but they were non-preventable collisions. And the person said to me, you know, how do you prevent the non-preventable collision is the question I asked. And he really, you know, dug in with me and looked at, which is one of Rebecca's favorite things, is looking at the root causes, like what factors are really contributing to causing these non-preventable collisions, because we need to prevent both preventable and non-preventable. And I think causal factors really relate to avoiding risk and trying to reduce putting ourselves in situations where we can, you know, have non-preventable, preventable collisions. And so just trying to put myself in that mindset of how do you prevent the non-preventable collision has helped me really dig in and get to the root causes of how and why collisions are happening.
That's an excellent point, and I think you're exactly right. Non-preventable can mean, you know, we, the agency, so to speak, might not be able to prevent it, but there are factors outside that are likely could make it preventable, and it's a matter of understanding those and then working with the right people, the right parties to make that happen.
And I think the challenge is, right, a lot of times when we look at preventability, and we didn't talk about this earlier, but we're looking at whether or not the driver could have prevented the collision or not. We're not looking at whether or not the agency. So when we determine a collision to be preventable or non-preventable, we're looking at it as what the driver's actions were, not all those causal factors of whether or not we could have prevented this by avoiding the risk in the first place.
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent point. Rebecca, over to you. Love to hear your thoughts as well.
Oh, sure. Well, I am a very visual person, and one of my, well, a couple of my staffers are much smarter than I am, luckily, and they introduced me to something called a bow tie analysis. So that's our preferred mechanism. And so what that is, I mean, it looks like a bow tie, hence the name. So it really traces back from after you determine the risk ultimately, right? Which there can be a lot of different risks stemming from hazards. So you're able to trace back like all of the mitigations that are in place, right? And what went wrong at the core, right? So it goes through like all of the potential consequences stemming from all of the potential hazards. Like, I don't know, I find that to be the absolute most useful. I've used 5 Whys, I've used Fishbones, and that's just where I land. I don't think that there's any right answer. It's whatever works for every person.
I think that's an excellent point. You're right. There isn't one approach that's going to work for everything. It's what works for you and for your team and for the people that are charged with understanding these events, conducting the investigations, and understanding the factors and ultimately getting to the mitigations. Well, at this point, I want to thank both of you. This has been a great discussion.